It happens that it was in the 60s, 1967 to be exact. And so you have to go back in time and try to know what we had. We didn't have MRI scans. We didn't have carbamazepine. We didn't have Benton. So the patients didn't even have much drugs that they could take. I had finished my residency in Seattle and had the option of going into private practice or staying with universities, and I opted to stay with universities for what we consider academic medicine, because I was interested in new things and making things better. And I fortunately had an opportunity and took it to come to the UCLA Department of Neurosurgery, and ended up as a starter to run the neurosurgical program at the Southern Los Angeles County Hospital that was affiliated with UCLA, Harvard General in Torrance. And it was a primarily emergency room source of patients, but it was very interesting and very busy. But I came to know all the residents because we had joint meetings, and I went back and forth between Harvard General and UCLA. But the most impressive resident at the time was Dr. Peter Janetta. And in 1967, he was the chief resident at UCLA. And I had talked to him many times about trigeminal neuralgia because he was very interested in it and in the documents in the literature, particularly those by Dr. Walter Dandy, who was a neurosurgeon at Johns Hopkins in the 30s and 40s, and had written a lot of articles and trying to get neurosurgeons to pay attention to the fact that he had found that you should look at the trigeminal nerve in the posterior fossa, which means in the back of the head, not just in the nerve in the front of the head. And Dr. Janetta was very interested in this and had gone to conferences around, had started doing cadaver dissections at UCLA and trying to prepare to do what Dr. Dandy had recommended neurosurgeons to do, but that was not the standard of care in 1960s. It was a subtemporal procedure. He wanted to do what Dr. Dandy had suggested after he practiced in cadaver labs. But the chairman of neurosurgery at UCLA did not think that residents should be doing anything other than what he considered the standard of care. And I disagree with that because I thought I came there to make things better, not just repeat what was being done. And so when a patient came into Harvard General emergency room, a 50-year-old man with excruciating right face pain, who was telling the guys in the ER that if they didn't come up with some treatment, he was going to take suicide as the treatment. So they admitted him to neurosurgery, and I called Peter Janetta, and I said, this is it, we're ready to go. The biggest issue, even then, was the county hospital didn't have a operating room microscope, which we thought was essential because you're doing much more fine work and you need good lighting. But fortunately, another nurse surgeon at UCLA, Bob Rand, had purchased with his own money an operating microscope because he was working on trying to do a better job with acoustic neuromas. And once we called him, he agreed to bring his microscope, which had to have a big stand in the operating room, put it in the back of his car, and brought it to Harvard General. And the patient was happy to have his trigeminal neuralgia disappear. So we managed to get the operating room with Dr. Rand and his microscope and Dr. Janetta and myself in the room and begin the operating procedure with the patient's consent. We decided to let Dr. Janetta do the opening because he had done this in the laboratory and neither Dr. Rand or I had. So we were both scrubbed and in the room the whole time as his supervisors, but he was showing us what he knew how to do that we really hadn't done yet. So he entered through the posterior fossa on the right side, followed the trigeminal nerve from where it comes out of the skull base and going into the pons. And noted immediately that number one, this patient didn't have a tumor, but he had an unusual amount of blood vessels around his trigeminal nerve with an unusual amount of thick arachnoid. So it took a long time to dissect away the arachnoid, and he did find a vessel that was compressing the trigeminal nerve at its entry into the brainstem, which he was able to move away and hold away. Everything was very stable, no problem, no bleeding, no problem. Patient woke up pain-free and went home on the third post-operative day. And this was the first microvascular decompression, which he named, not me, Peter Janetta, and he continued then to do them afterward. And we were very happy that we had established a new treatment. It took 5 to 10 years to spread through neurosurgery, but today it is the standard of care for trigeminal neuralgia, particularly if the MRI scan shows the vessel. So, Dr. Brown.
Stay there. So my name is Dr. Jeffrey Brown, and I have inherited the position of chair of the Medical Advisory Board of the Facial Pain Organization, founded because of the passion of Peter Janetta a quarter century ago. So I have this thing in my hand, which is to announce that things have come full circle, and the Medical Advisory Board has funded and established what we are going to call the John Alksne Young Investigator Award. And the plaque says, honoring Dr. John Alksne's courageous openness and support of young surgeons' innovative thinking, and the hope this award will carry forward that effort to the next generation of physicians. It will be given to the neurologist, neurosurgeon, dentist, oral maxillofacial surgeon, or plastic surgeon with the best paper submitted to the Medical Advisory Board on the treatment of facial pain in your honor.
Well, this is a very special honor, and I didn't expect it. I didn't sure I deserve it, but thank you too. Thanks so very much. Okay, we are going to move on with the conference, and the next speaker is Dr. Enheim. Come forward.
Specializes in the treatment of pain, specifically facial pain. I'm located right here at UCSD, and I've had the great benefit of the mentorship of my senior partner, Dr. John Alksne, over the past couple of years. And so today I'm going to talk to you, basically introduce the day, introduce the discussion. I have the great fortune of giving a talk on the anatomy and physiology of facial pain, which is a complicated topic that we'll try to get to. This is actually something I'm interested from both the clinical perspective and also part of my research as well. So let's get started. Facial pain is a devastating problem, as we all know. It truly has a considerable impact on our quality of life. And it's a pretty rare condition, as has been mentioned. Approximately 26.8 cases per 100,000 person years. There's an estimate of about 150,000 to 200,000 new cases just in the US alone per year. And 50% of patients ultimately require some sort of treatment secondary to a medication failure or intolerance of medication. So I'm going to give an introduction to my talk today. In talking about facial pain anatomy, I'm first going to start off by talking about the fact that we all have different types of pain. The pain from trigeminal neuralgia, for example, is very different from the pain we feel when we stub our toe or have surgery. And I'll go into a little bit about the types of things, the way we name these different types of pain. I'll then talk about nerves and neurons, which are the way our bodies conduct a signal from the outside world to the brain. I'll touch a little bit on that anatomy. I'm then going to basically trace the course of the trigeminal nerve, which is the nerve that is responsible in all of us for controlling both sensation and light touch of the face. I'm going to trace it as it goes from its fine peripheral fibers of the face into something called the trigeminal ganglion. And then I'm going to trace it from the trigeminal ganglion to a place called the root entry zone, where it enters into the brainstem before it then travels to the brain. And I'll briefly discuss what it does when it gets to the brain. Throughout the talk, I'm going to just mention the sites of surgical intervention because as surgeons, we basically figured out a way to intervene at every single part of this signal as it comes from the skin of the face, goes into the ganglion, goes into the brainstem, and then goes up and is interpreted by the brain. So I'm not going to get at all into the specifics of these procedures, which some of you might have already even had yourselves. We're going to be discussing that later on throughout the day in much, much more detail. But I am going to talk about, give you a sense of where all these different types of interventions take place. So let's first start and discuss types of pain. Well, you may or may not be surprised to know that there are really very different types of pain. And as doctors, the way that this pain feels helps us to understand a little bit about where it might be coming from and what it actually means. So generally, and this terminology is somewhat confusing. It's used by different doctors in different ways, but I'm going to give you just a very general overview of how these terms are used. Okay? We generally describe pain as being either nociceptive pain or neuropathic pain. So nociceptive pain is pain that is caused by damage. It's really what we think classically of as pain. Pain caused by damage to joints, caused by damage to muscles, by damage to skin, etc., etc., etc. And there are many different types of this. The most common, it's generally described by patients as sharp, aching, or throbbing pain. There are different special circumstances of this. Probably the most common one, the one we think of most classically as pain, is a somatic form of this type of nociceptive pain. This is the pain of arthritis, for example, when our joints hurt, or the pain from getting a paper cut when we damage our skin, or the pain of surgery, or the pain from when our muscles ache when we have a backache, etc. Another condition that's part of nociceptive pain is a very special condition, which is visceral pain. This pain feels different from classic nociceptive pain. It's much more general, like when we have a stomach ache. That's because of how the nerves are actually wired in our viscera. We don't need as much very specific information about where that pain is coming from. So we have a general sense that we have pain in our stomach, for example. Now let's talk about the other type of pain, called neuropathic pain. As opposed to the nociceptive pain that I mentioned, neuropathic pain is very special. It is caused very specifically by damage to nerves or the nervous system being peripheral nerves, the brain, or the spinal cord. Okay? And this type of pain feels very differently from the classic nociceptive type of pain, and is generally described as sharp, shooting, electric pain, tingling, numb, burning pain. This also has some special qualities, and from the perspective of peripheral, it can be described as neuralgic pain, and again, different doctors use this term differently, but neuralgic pain, which is generally classified as that more sharp electric type pain, or neuropathic pain, which is kind of everything else, the numb, burning, tingling type of pain. And this really is the pain from the peripheral nervous system of trigeminal neuralgia. Trigeminal neuralgia, postherpetic neuralgia, the facial pain of multiple sclerosis. This is what that feels like. It's a very specific type of pain, again, caused by damage to a nerve, or arising from a nerve. There's also a condition we won't get into that is caused by damage to other parts of the central nervous system, like post-stroke pain, which is a very specific type of pain. Today we're going to focus on this peripheral, neuralgic and neuropathic pain. So, what are the functions of nerves in our body? The functions of nerves are to transmit signals, as you all know, from the outside world to our brain, and to transmit signals from our brain to our bodies. This is how we sense touch, and this is also how we sense pain. So, for example, in a very basic model, very simplified version of this, when our finger touches an object or senses a painful object, That signal is transmitted first from the very fine, delicate nerves of our hands, then to larger peripheral nerves in our arms, and then this signal goes into the spinal cord, where it then travels up and goes into the brain, and our brain interprets, my finger felt something, or my finger felt pain. Now, these nerves themselves, as you can see in this upper circle, are actually made up of individual neurons. Neurons are the cells that comprise nerves that specifically transmit these signals. And this system that functions this way in the arm and in the fingers functions exactly the same way in the face. And it's sort of important to understand the scale of these things. Neurons are cells. They're definitely too small to see, but many hundreds and hundreds of thousands of them come together to comprise a nerve. And a nerve is a physical structure in our body. And for example, this nerve in the arm might be, for example, the size, roughly almost the size and shape of us, but maybe even a little bit bigger, that you see here. And it's the same way for the trigeminal nerve. So to get into even more depth, there are really many different types of these neurons within each nerve. Not all of these neurons are the same, and different types of neurons convey different types of information to the brain. So some of these neurons, like the alpha-beta neuron here, convey light touch information to the brain. Some of these neurons, like the alpha-delta or the C-fiber neuron, conveys pain information to the brain. So there's actually different neurons within these nerves that convey different information. These neurons, again, then travel through the body to the spinal cord, where they then transmit the signal to another neuron, which then transmits the signal to another neuron, and then finally goes into the brain to interpret the signal. So I have a question for the audience. Which of these is built to convey signals to the brain faster? Is it the neurons that convey light touch or the neurons that convey pain? So show of hands. Who thinks it's the neurons that convey light touch? Who thinks it's the signals that convey pain? So there is some variation here actually between alpha delta and alpha beta fibers. But they're all very, very, very fast. But actually, not all, but some of these pain neurons really are the fastest. And that's because that our body believes that sensing pain is very important. You need to know very quickly if your hand is on fire, or if you've just touched a very sharp object. You need to know that, if your brain needs to know that information very quickly. And so these pain signals are extremely important part of our anatomy and physiology. If we didn't have pain signals, we might get hurt all the time, for example. So it's really when there's an aberration of this pain processing or a problem with this basic pain system that we feel chronic pain. And chronic pain is obviously not helpful to our bodies and not really helpful at all to survival. So now let's talk about the face. So as I mentioned, these systems function in exactly the same way in the face. But the face and head are very specific, have a very specific set of requirements. These nerves have very specialized functions that the body doesn't have, like for example, hearing and smelling and seeing. And so these functions of the face and the head are carried out by a very specific set of nerves in the face called the cranial nerves. We all have 2 sets of 12 cranial nerves. As I go through this, you'll realize that we've named everything. Every single tiny little structure in the brain and body has a name. And so these nerves are all numbered from 1 through 12, and they all also have a name. So for example, the first cranial nerve is the nerve, is called the olfactory nerve, and it's the nerve that senses smell. The 7th cranial nerve is called the facial nerve, and that's the nerve that controls the muscles of the face. The 5th cranial nerve, which is what we're all interested in today, is called the trigeminal nerve. And it controls both light touch and pain sensations of the face, and has some other small functions. We all have 2 trigeminal nerves, one that controls the sensation of the right side of the face, and one that controls the sensation of the left side of the face. And here you can see this is the trigeminal nerve amongst all of the 12 cranial nerves. So now let's get a better look at the trigeminal nerve. It has very fine branches at its end, which you see here. All of these branches have names. These branches then come together into the three main branches of the nerve, which we call V1, V2, and V3. That V is actually the Roman numeral for the number 5. This is the 5th cranial nerve. And these also have names. V1 is also called the ophthalmic nerve, V2 is called the maxillary nerve, and V3 is called the mandibular nerve. And each of these branches, V1 and V2 and V3, is responsible for a territory of a very specific part of the face, and you can see that outlined there. These major branches then come together and form something called the trigeminal ganglion. This is also called the Gasserian ganglion or the semilunar ganglion. As I mentioned briefly, I'll talk about some common and also some very uncommon types of surgeries throughout this talk. And so the very first intervention I'll talk about targets the very most peripheral part of this nerve, which is called a peripheral nerve stimulator. So some people, for some very specialized conditions, might actually place a stimulator just under the skin to target these very, very, very peripheral branches. Another intervention, which you might have heard of or seen or maybe even had, are the percutaneous procedures, which involve placing a needle through the skin of the face directly into this area, the trigeminal ganglion, where these branches V1 and V2 and V3 come together. Through this needle, we can do one of several things. We can inflate a balloon called balloon compression. We can use heat called RF ablation or radio frequency ablation, or we can inject something called glycerol to numb the nerve, all through the same approach and targeting this specific trigeminal ganglion. So now let's move on. Let's follow the nerve now from the ganglion as it continues to travel deeper and deeper into the head until it enters the brainstem at a structure called the pons. Now the brainstem is basically an extension of the spinal cord, okay? And it also is subdivided into several parts, and one of these parts is called the pons. This is where that trigeminal nerve continues and enters into the brainstem. The site where this nerve goes into the brainstem is called the root entry zone, or REZ. The root entry zone is the site where the root enters the pons, or the brainstem. So this is the classic site, this root entry zone. It's a classic area where we might find a blood vessel compressing the nerve. And it is the site of microvascular decompression, where we go in with a microscope, find that blood vessel, and move it away. This is actually the view that a neurosurgeon would see in the operating room. And I don't expect you to understand this anatomy. This is why we go to school for so long and then train for so long. But here you can see, we see under the microscope very clearly the trigeminal nerve. We see very clearly that artery that compresses the nerve, and our job as neurosurgeons is to move that artery away from the nerve and to keep it away. And we'll talk about this in much more depth in later talks. But before we do surgery, we get an MRI, okay? That MRI can show us very clearly this part of the brain, the root entry zone, where that nerve enters the brainstem or enters the pons before it travels up into the brain. This is what it looks like on an MRI. We have to get very specialized sequences of MRIs to see this nerve, and some MRIs are much better than others, and Dr. Alksne will talk about that in a little bit later today. But this is where we look for that blood vessel on the MRI right in this area. This also is the area where we do gamma knife radiosurgery, which I will actually discuss in a little bit more detail later on today. Right at this site, where the nerve enters the pons. So, once the nerve enters the brainstem, things get a lot more complicated. And I'm just going to touch on this very briefly. So, most nerve signals go directly up to the brain when they enter the spinal cord or when they enter the brainstem. Not the trigeminal nerve, it's more complicated. It decides first to take a downward turn in the spinal trigeminal tract. It then forms a synapse or a connection at a very specific place called the nucleus caudalis. Now, as this nerve goes down, it actually can go as low as the upper level of your neck, the high part of your neck. It then crosses over, it synapses in that place called the nucleus caudalis, which we'll actually see here. It then crosses over to the other side, like all of our nerves eventually cross when they go to the brain. It then travels up the other side in something called the trigeminothalamic tract. It then goes all the way up to a place in the brain called the thalamus. And then in the thalamus, it goes to a very specific nucleus called the ventral posterior medial nucleus of the thalamus. And then it goes into the brain and gets interpreted as a signal. And just briefly, you can see here the anatomy of that nucleus, the nucleus caudalis. This is also the site of some very rare and unusual surgical interventions that target facial pain, not mostly uncommon forms of facial pain. And this is the site of a nucleus caudalis DRES procedure, or dorsal root entry zone lesioning procedure, which you may or may not have ever heard of. This is some people, very rarely, also put stimulators in this area to try to intercept that signal as it goes into the brain. So, moving forward, where does it go after it leaves the thalamus? The thalamus is this major relay nucleus in the brain. It's kind of where it's the highway, the major highway. It's where all the signals go through the brain before they actually go to the part of the brain called our cerebral cortex. So where does it go from here? Well, it turns out this is actually an extremely complicated answer. It is, classically when you look at our medical school textbooks, we put it to the somatosensory cortex, and that's where we interpret other types of signals, like light touch signals. But pain, turns out, is really complicated in its representation in the brain. This is actually part of my research study, and it turns out that pain goes everywhere. It's all over the brain. It goes to the limbic circuits, which control your emotional sensations of pain. It goes to the hippocampus, which is where memories of pain are stored, and so on and so forth. It's really located all over the brain. And not surprisingly, neurosurgeons have figured out a way to intervene even here, and on very rare occasions, when nothing else has worked and everything has failed, we might even consider putting a stimulator into the brain itself, into that thalamic region where those pain signals are intercepted, in only, again, in very rare circumstances, and we'll discuss that later today. So to quickly sum up what we've just talked about, we have figured out a way to intervene really in all the different parts of the trigeminal nerve as it goes from the skin and goes into the three major branches, V1, V2, V3, into the Gasserian ganglion, or the trigeminal ganglion, which is the site of these percutaneous procedures like balloon compression or RF ablation. We have that then travels further deep into the brain and enters the brainstem at a level called the pons. That area where it enters the brainstem is where we perform gamma knife procedures, which are aimed at the nerve itself, and where we perform microvascular decompressions, where the goal is to remove that artery away from the nerve if there is an artery there. Some additional interventions we've discussed for facial pain involve placing stimulators actually under the skin, intervening at that place in the brainstem called the nucleus caudalis, DRES procedures, placing stimulators there, and even as far as placing stimulators into the brain regions. So, thank you very much.